The Aria of the Soul is seriously one of the most gorgeous pieces of music in video gaming. Immediately from its onset, the piano and strings invoke such a rich, pensive atmosphere onto its listener. Its smooth but evocative lines and gestures, its direct but subtly complex rhythmic identity, and its modern yet idiomatically classical textures imbue the theme with a fastidious wave of undercurrent that is only suitable for the Velvet Room. These elements are glued together by an equally nuanced harmonic progression underpinning the introduction's development. I wish I could elaborate on all of the individual gears making the opening of this track tick, but today I just want to dissect its harmonic progression. I actually only have one instance within the opening that I want to elaborate on. This is a moment that harmonically I find really quite interesting and intelligent, but also to be emblematic of the nuance contained in this theme. I'm going to let you listen to it with the annotated score in front of you, and let's see if you can locate which moment that I'm describing. Your eyes and ears probably jump to this chord right here. It's raw and dramatic, serving a distinct, vibrant function within the progression. It even looks important. I mean, just look at all those accidentals. Even its Roman numeral is distinct compared to the rest of its peers. While this chord will be important in setting up the moment I'm referring to, it's not what I want to focus on today. Instead, I really want to break down the relationship between these two unsuspecting chords. I think something really unique is going on in the juxtaposition despite looking unassuming at a first glance. Before we do that though, I really need to describe the overall harmonic progression in its totality so that we can have the context to fully understand their impact. The progression begins in B minor, but ends on a resolution to a D major chord. This immediately implies that we're going to modulate to B minor's relative major key. While this is a really common type of modulation, we still need to consider that at some point the progression is going to have to switch from being analyzed in the former key to the latter, which means some chords will probably need to be analyzed in both B minor and B major. In this case, the modulation is through something called a pivot chord, or a chord that we enter in the former key and then leave as though it was in the latter. Moving between our two endpoints now, the progression begins with a walk down from our tonic B minor chord to a G major 7, B flat 6. The chord between the two could be labeled in a couple different ways, but functionally it exists as a passing chord for the bass to move from the B down to the G. This micro progression is then repeated with a wider and more varied set of notes. These first 4 bars could be described as tonic prolongation. It's dabbling and elaborating within the tonic function, sounding really nice, but not really developing the progression forward. We're then quickly shot up to the 3-chord D major, introducing our ears to the sound of the relative major key that we'll be moving to. At the moment though, it's still functioning in B minor and thus is exhibiting a different role. Compare this chord to the D major at the end and notice how the feeling between the two D major chords is vastly different. I skipped this one because it actually requires the context of its surroundings to identify. It's a C-sharp major chord, which you may have noticed does not fit into B minor, making it a chromatic chord of some sort. Generally, we identify and name chromatic chords based on their function within a progression. Based on its surroundings, this one is pretty obviously an applied chord. The function of an applied chord is to tonicize another chord, or to briefly make a non-tonic chord into a tonic or root. The difference between modulation and tonicization is that a modulation will usually be long-term, happening over a phrase with the expectation that it'll be maintained. While tonicization is more transient. It's intended to be brief, and the chord being tonicized usually immediately relinquishes its position back to the proper tonic after being resolved to. In this case, the C sharp major is tonicizing the F sharp minor chord. If we think about C sharp major in the key of F sharp minor, it would function as the major 5 or the dominant chord. This makes C sharp major the 5 of the minor 5 in B minor, or put more simply, the 5 of 5. Tonicizations add a lot of spice to a progression. They not only create more of a pull in novel and interesting directions, but the jump from a diatonic to a chromatic chord is often fairly jarring to the ear. An ounce of disorder is created when you use an applied chord, and that disorder can then be relinquished by resolving back into the key by way of the tonicized chord. We can take the context of the tonicization further by connecting it to the D major chord before it. If we reframe it into our tonicized F sharp minor key, it looks like a flat 6 chord, extending the entire tonicization into flat 6, 5, 1, a very textbook but effective minor progression. This makes the D major chord a sort of quasi-pivot chord into itself, manifesting a more organic transition into the applied chord. With all of that put into place, we're missing just our one crucial element, and it has to do with the accidental right here. This G sharp is not native to either of our keys. Diatonically, this note should be a G natural, making the chord scale, or the scale relative to the F sharp minor chord that we're on, F sharp Phrygian. With the raised second, however, it's actually F sharp Aeolian. Melodically, this accidental's inclusion is logical in that both of the lower and upper piano voices, the G sharp leads up by half step to the minor third of the chord, this A natural. Due to this half step relation, the major second in minor or Aeolian more readily tends to push toward the minor third than the minor second of Phrygian does. If we relate this change back to the key that we're in, remember this is the pivot chord, we need to think of it in terms of B minor and D major. This chord, including the passing second scale degree, more closely delineates B Dorian or D Lydian, which are both one notch brighter on the circle of fifths. This quasi-modal interchange lightly brightens the zenith of the progression, making it more prominent, drastic, dramatic, whatever word you want to insert here. But it does so in a very inconspicuous manner due to the relative insignificance of the passing tone that is the second scale degree of the chord scale. Not only do we have this natural subliminality masking this modal shift, but the applied dominant chord before it does so as well. Dominant chords, even those that are just triads, are so pointed toward a resolution point that when used as an applied chord, they redirect the ear in a very strong manner. In doing so, our ears readjust to the new tonic more readily, which consequently weakens our attachment to the previous tonic. The modality of the previous key is thus more malleable after the resolution, making a sudden change in pitch content a more natural sounding occurrence. Following the F sharp minor chord, we move to an E minor chord, relinquishing our added accidental. This change provides two alterations to the color of our progression, one more apparent than the other. Firstly, the shift back to the darker collection of pitches contrasts with the heightened climax that was the arrival of the F sharp minor chord. This contrast sets the listener up to more readily feel the drop from a tempestuous fever to something more gentle and grounded. More interestingly though, the progression loses some of the clarity in its direction. Earlier I mentioned something called a chord scale, which is broadly the concept that each individual chord can be represented by a corresponding individual scale. This is separate from the scale that makes up our key or mode. It only represents the singular chord being expressed at that moment. For instance, in C major, a 2 chord would most readily be represented by the relative D Dorian scale, despite the progression being in C major. In C minor, a 2 chord would be represented by its relative D Locrian. We can continue to apply this idea to each diatonic chord by assigning it its corresponding mode. which will always be the relative scale starting on that chord's root. In this way, as long as we're functioning within a diatonic progression, we can inversely assume which chord scale should be used over any given Roman numeral. In the Aria of the Soul, our last three chords, including the focal point of this video, is a 3-2-1 progression in D major. The expectation for the corresponding chord scales to that progression would be D major's third mode, its second mode, and its first mode, which would be F sharp Phrygian, E Dorian, and finally D major or Ionian respectively. We don't have the specific pitches to label these two chord scales definitively as E Dorian or D Ionian with their respective sets of pitches on their own, but the key of D major as a grand unifier delineates them as so. The isolated chords and the melodies over them could fit into a couple of scales, but in context with each other, the characteristic tones of each mode are used in the other's melody, which, along with our trained tonal understanding, is enough for our ears to assume their modal identity. As I stated earlier, however, we explicitly do not have F sharp Phrygian. Phrygian would need to have a flattened second scale degree, which would be a G natural, not our raised G sharp. We instead have F sharp Aeolian. The problem with F sharp minor moving to E minor is that due to the raised G sharp, the two chords no longer fit into this diatonic chord scale mold. The chords can exist naturally, but the added context of the major second revokes the natural relation. There just isn't a diatonic point where two minor chord scales with major seconds occur a whole step apart. Despite the chord triads showing us a diatonic 3-2-1, this non-diatonic relationship of chord scales obscures the key and thus extricates the chordal motion from any sense of direction to an endpoint. In doing so, it creates an unknown trajectory in our progression, which works to disorient our ears. The chromaticism only occurring in the modal realm and not within the chord tones makes this transgression less apparent. We still have the more prominent element, the actual triads, working in a logical diatonic framework, but the less perceptible second scale degree within the chord scale creates an undercurrent of disorientation. It's made subliminally otherworldly. With an additional layer of analysis, we can also see that the chord scale relationship is consequently creating parallel motion. This usually means that the same exact chord is repeated at different positions. In this case, however, it's not a literal shift in the harmonic shape, but instead the repeated use of the scale degrees 1, 2, flat 3, and 5 in both chords. This type of relationship further relinquishes any sense of directional progression due to the music sitting on a repeated chordal identity that has no indication of moving anywhere. This is really common practice in film music, as it can combine with a number of different types of chords to evoke complex emotions. Effectually, this chordal relationship creates a question for our progression. Where are we? What is happening? Are we going anywhere? I just left this place but haven't gotten any farther along. Where am I? A minute ago I was in bed and now I've just woken up in this strange room with a devilish man sitting at the desk in front of me. The applied chord serves to prepare the non-progressive motion as well. We were clearly in B minor before suddenly being whisked away to F sharp minor by tonicization, and as soon as we're reoriented, we lose some of the sense of tonality. We can't reference it to B minor because we were just led astray and haven't been rooted back into it, but we can't reference it in F sharp minor either because we haven't been there long enough to feel like we were set in it as a new tonic. In this way, the applied chord largely works as a palate cleanser. It sets us up to hear and accept something new. The sense of disorientation is then resolved as we find our way to the D major, because it gives us the information to determine where we just came from. Only when the D major chord is actually expressed can we determine that the E minor chord was functioning as a 2 chord in D the whole time. Part of knowing that it was a Dorian chord scale and in context that it was a 2 chord was that we knew that we were in the key of D major. Until the actual tonic D major chord was expressed, we had no idea that this was the case. In this way, the arrival to the tonic is immensely cathartic. It contextualizes the E minor chord. The chord that felt like it was pulling us away is revealed to be the path back to our familiar relative major destination, and now the entire path we traveled can be rationalized. What we were wary of is explained to us, and in doing so, we as listeners can feel the transition from apprehension to calm acceptance. The progression in the introduction of the Aria of the Soul itself reinforces the narrative of the introduction to the Velvet Room. You're safe in your own life. Maybe something unusual has happened on the other side of town. Maybe even something alarming. But life goes on. All of a sudden you're pulled away from your normal life to somewhere you've really never been. It's so unfamiliar, and you're filled with question after question as you begin talking to the strange man in front of you. You're then told why you're here and what you need to do moving forward. You return to your world, but with a new perspective. At this point, I'm probably being a little over the top with finding connections to the story, and really I could probably frame the progression to match a number of different emotional contexts, but I'm doing it with the hope that you can see how these small harmonic choices can create a compounding ripple in a piece of music's affect, especially when supporting a larger narrative. If you like this video, please let me know however that comes to you. I'm still in the process of honing all of the different crafts that align in making these sorts of projects come together, but this is seriously the most fun I've had in a while. This kind of stuff is what I think about in the shower every day, and then inevitably spend half an hour relaying to my very uninterested partner. So I really hope some of you out there find this stuff interesting and maybe even as useful as I do. Hopefully if you watched this till the end, you'll stick around for more, so I'll see you then.